In 1918, Theodore Roosevelt's influence led to a report most people have never read. The records of the time said, "The system of meatpacking in this country is a menace to the public health and a public scandal. The Big Five packers have created a stranglehold on American agriculture that must be broken." The Big Five controlled 45% of beef processing. Roosevelt had been president. He had used his authority to challenge them in court. But instead of a total breakup, the industry was regulated. He helped create inspection requirements, paperwork, and licensing. This regulation inadvertently created barriers to entry. By 1950, the Big Five still controlled roughly half the market. By 1980, the Big Four controlled 36%. By 2024, four companies control 81% of American beef: Tyson, Cargill, JBS, National Beef. These four corporations process roughly 32 million cattle per year. They are more powerful than Roosevelt feared. They are less visible. In 1920, you could see the beef trust. The processing plants were visible. The corporate structure was transparent. Today, you cannot see it. The consolidation is hidden inside supply chain architecture. That invisibility is the mechanism's greatest strength. This is the Gilded Archives, where the most dangerous monopolies are the ones you don't know exist. The records show something specific about American beef production. It operates on a system designed in 1890 and perfected in 1920 and never fundamentally changed. A rancher raises cattle on pasture for 3 years. Then, when the cattle reach market weight, he sells them to a meat packer. The meat packer butchers, processes, and distributes. That's the model. It hasn't changed. What changed is who controls the supply between those 2 points. In 1940, there were over 1,000 independent meatpacking plants in America. Processing was fragmented. A rancher could sell to the plant in his region. Prices were competitive. Margins were distributed. By 2024, the vast majority of processing is handled by a small handful of massive plants. The consolidation happened through a mechanism so elegant that governments watched it happen and couldn't stop it because it looked legal. It looked efficient. It looked like innovation. The architecture started with something called vertical integration in reverse, similar to what Walmart deployed in retail. But meatpacking is more complex because it involves physical supply chains and cannot be executed instantly. The mechanism requires 3 layers. First, the feedlot. A rancher's cattle don't go straight from pasture to processing. They go to a feedlot for finishing. A feedlot is a facility where cattle are fed grain for 90 to 150 days before slaughter. In the past, there were thousands of independent feedlots in America. A rancher could take his cattle to any feedlot. Feedlots competed on price. By 2024, Tyson, Cargill, and JBS own or control a massive portion of feedlot capacity. A rancher cannot sell his cattle to any feedlot anymore. He often sells to a feedlot owned or contracted by the company that will eventually process his cattle. The rancher never sees another buyer. The feedlot is a captive facility. The rancher is locked in. Second, the contract. Here's where the system becomes inescapable. In the past, when a rancher raised cattle, he would take them to market when he decided. He would receive the commodity market price minus a small fee to the buyer. It was simple. In 2024, roughly 75% of fed cattle are raised on contract or alternative marketing arrangements. The rancher agrees to provide cattle of specific genetics, raised to specific specifications, finished on specific feed. The packer decides genetics. The packer decides feed. The packer decides finishing date. In exchange, the rancher receives a contracted price that is often below the peak commodity market price. Why would a rancher take this deal? Because the open market price is influenced by the same 4 companies. A rancher can raise cattle independently and sell at commodity price. Or he can accept a contract with a preset price but guaranteed income. When one option is guaranteed lower income and the other option is a volatile price controlled by the buyer's demand, the rancher feels he has no choice. The records show the vast majority choosing the contract. They didn't choose. They were forced to choose between 2 arrangements where the consolidator won both ways. This is the inversion of classical monopoly. Classical monopoly controls supply. A monopolist buys all the inputs at low prices and sells the output at high prices. They control the margins. Meatpacking doesn't work that way. The rancher controls the input. He raises the cattle. The consumer controls the output. He demands beef. The consolidator sits in the middle and controls the flow. If the rancher can't sell cattle except through a contract, and the contract is worth less than the independent market could offer, the rancher absorbs the loss. If the consumer demands beef at retail prices below the wholesale cost, the processor absorbs the loss temporarily until they have eliminated independent competitors. Then they raise wholesale prices. The rancher never knows the retail price of his beef. The consumer never knows what the rancher was paid. The processor sits in the middle, invisible, controlling the flow. The data reveals the extraction mechanism with precision. A rancher raising cattle on grass for 3 years and then feedlotting for 4 months pays high feed costs plus labor and land costs. In many years, the total cost per animal exceeds the sale price. In 2024, a rancher's costs are higher than ever. The commodity price might look high on paper, but the rancher isn't always selling at that price. He's selling under contract. He's raising cattle at a razor-thin margin or a loss. Why would he do this? Because if he doesn't, the major packers won't provide feedlot space or a guaranteed slaughter date, and without that, he can't sell cattle at all. The rancher is trapped. He loses money either way, but under contract, the loss is predictable. Under the commodity market controlled by consolidators, the loss can be catastrophic. The records show what happens next. When ranchers lose money consistently, they exit the business. Between 1992 and 2022, the number of beef cow operations in America declined from roughly 922,000 to 711,000. That's a 23% reduction. The ranchers who remain are either very large operations that can absorb losses or are locked into long-term contracts. Consolidation at the ranching level happened simultaneously with consolidation at the processing level. Small ranchers got squeezed out. Large ranchers survived by accepting lower prices. The wealth that would have distributed across nearly 1 million ranchers now distributes across fewer hands, and even those remaining are often losing money. The profit went to the 4 companies in the middle. The comparison to historical monopoly is exact, but reveals why meatpacking consolidation is more dangerous than previous monopolies. Standard Oil owned refineries. They directly controlled production. If the government forced a breakup, separate refineries existed. The physical infrastructure couldn't be instantly recombined. Meatpacking consolidation doesn't own all the ranches. The ranches still exist, but they're bound by contracts that make them economically dependent on the consolidator. A government-forced breakup of Tyson wouldn't help ranchers immediately. The ranches would still exist, but they would still need feedlot space and processing capacity. Without those, they can't sell cattle. If the feedlots and processing plants are still owned by someone, the ranches are still trapped. The consolidation is structural, not just corporate. By 1970, the system had stabilized around several major packers. The government had an opportunity to intervene. Instead, they deregulated. The 1980s brought Reagan-era shifts in antitrust enforcement. Environmental rules were relaxed. Labor protections were reduced. In 1985, a meatpacking plant employed roughly 1,200 workers. By 2000, the same plant capacity employed more workers for the same output. The efficiency gain was often wage suppression. Workers were paid less in real terms. The speed of processing increased, the danger increased, the profit increased. Between 1980 and 2000, meatpacking wages declined significantly in real terms. Processing speeds increased from 300 cattle per hour to over 400 cattle per hour in many facilities. Plant injuries increased. The consolidators extracted profit through wage suppression and speed, not just through innovation. The architecture shows 4 designers across the consolidation. First, Gustavus Swift, who in 1880 invented the refrigerated rail car. Swift didn't invent consolidation. He invented the infrastructure that made consolidation possible. Before the refrigerated car, cattle had to be processed locally. After the refrigerated car, beef could be processed centrally and distributed nationally. Second, J. Ogden Armour, who perfected the vertical integration of ranching, feedlotting, processing, and distribution. By 1900, Armour influenced the entire flow. When the government moved against the Big Five trust with the 1920 consent decree, Armour's integrated model was restricted. But the regulation that followed made it more attractive for survivors. Environmental compliance, health inspection, labor regulations. These requirements created such high barriers to entry that the only companies that could afford to build processing plants were large operations. Small packers couldn't afford the compliance costs. Third, modern leaders at Cargill and Tyson in the 1970s and 80s who deployed supply chain systems to control rancher contracts. For the first time, they could track cattle from birth to slaughter. They could predict prices, adjust contracts, and lock in margin. The rancher became visible to the corporation. The corporation remained invisible to everyone else. Fourth, JBS Group, which deployed global scale in the 1990s. JBS bought multiple regional packers and consolidated them into one supply chain. They brought global beef production into the American market, allowing them to optimize across borders. Every time you buy ground beef, you're engaging with this mechanism. You buy a pound for $5. The retailer and the packer take their share. The rancher's total cost often leaves him with pennies or a loss. You saved money compared to what ground beef would cost in a fragmented market. The packer kept a share as profit. The retailer kept a share as profit. You won. The packer won. The retailer won. The rancher lost. But the rancher is invisible to you. You never see him. You never know he's losing money on every animal he raises. The geometry is perfect. Everyone except the rancher appears to benefit. But there's a second layer the records reveal. The packer's profit is captured by destroying the rancher's alternatives. If the rancher could sell to an independent packer, The rancher might receive a higher price. The independent packer might sell to the retailer. The consumer might pay more. Prices would be higher, but distributed differently. The rancher would profit. The independent packer would profit. The large integrated packer would have no market. By controlling the feedlots and processing plants, the consolidator can prevent that scenario. The rancher has nowhere to sell except to a consolidator. The independent packer has no supply. The consumer never knows an alternative price is possible. The system is so tightly integrated that breaking it would require every level simultaneously changing. That's impossible. The consolidator has trapped the entire supply chain. The records show what happened to independent packers. In the 1980s, dozens of independent beef processing plants were operating in America. By 2024, that number has collapsed. The independent plants didn't fail because they were inefficient. They failed because they couldn't compete with integrated supply chains. A rancher with a contract with Tyson couldn't sell to an independent packer. An independent packer without contracted cattle supply couldn't negotiate with retailers. The infrastructure that made consolidators powerful made independents invisible. The records of specific plants show this happening in sequence. In Sterling, Colorado, a major processing plant operated for decades. In the 2000s, as Cargill consolidated operations, regional supply was rerouted. By 2006, the local processing economy was fundamentally altered when the plant closed. One large plant in a different location could handle the volume. The local processing economy disappeared. The second mechanism the records reveal is price manipulation at the commodity market level. Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef collectively influence what you see as the beef price. The USDA reports live cattle prices daily. Ranchers use this price as a reference point, but these four companies control approximately 80% of the supply. When they reduce purchases, the market price drops. When they increase purchases, it rises. A rancher watching the commodity price thinks he's participating in a free market. He's actually watching the four companies signal to each other through buying patterns. In antitrust language, this is called tacit collusion. No written agreement, no phone calls. Just market behavior that's so coordinated it appears simultaneous. The rancher sees price drop, stop selling. The consolidators see price drop, buy more aggressively. By the time prices recover, the consolidators have bought low and can sell higher. The rancher sold at the bottom. The records show this pattern repeating. Commodity beef prices dropped 23% in 2015. Major packers reported record profit margins that year. The rancher made nothing. The consolidators captured the entire value. We are at stage 6 of the consolidation pattern. Stage 1 was Gustavus Swift's refrigerated railcar invention in 1880. Stage 2 was Armour's vertical integration in 1890 to 1920. Stage 3 was the regulatory response in the early 20th century, which paradoxically enabled further consolidation through barrier to entry creation. Stage 4 was the shifts of the 1980s, which allowed the remaining large players to absorb smaller ones through acquisition. Stage 5 was computerization and contract control in the 1990s, which locked ranchers into dependence. Stage 6, where we are now, is global consolidation through companies like JBS, which operates globally. They can source cattle internationally and pit ranchers in different countries against each other. An American rancher competing with global processing capacity has no advantage. The consolidator optimizes globally. The rancher is local. The three paths forward require acknowledging the system's completeness. First, accept the consolidation and work within it. The system delivers cheap beef to consumers. Processing is efficient. The supply chain works. The cost is that ranchers lose money and exit the industry. By 2040, most beef will be raised under contract to major processors. The traditional independent rancher will largely disappear. This isn't a moral failing. It's structural mathematics. Accepting it means recognizing that American beef is now a subsidy from ranchers to consumers. The rancher loses money. The consumer gets cheap protein. The major packers profit. This is the trade. Cheap beef for you requires ranchers to operate at a loss. Most people would choose that trade if offered explicitly. Most people don't realize that's the trade because it's invisible. Second, resist through alternative supply chains. Direct-to-consumer beef from ranchers, farmers markets, and independent producers exists in some regions. It costs significantly more than consolidated beef. A pound of grass-fed beef that cost $5 at Walmart costs much more from an independent rancher. The cost is material, but the rancher profits. The supply chain is transparent. You know what happened. You know the rancher wasn't paid less than his costs. The availability of this option is regional. Urban areas with high-income populations can sustain independent ranchers. Rural areas cannot. The consolidation has created a two-tier system where wealthy consumers can buy from alternative supply chains, and poor consumers are locked into consolidated supply chains. Third, position within the consolidation. If the rancher cannot compete independently and the packer is inevitable, the rational position is to become a large rancher with multiple contract relationships. A 5,000 head cattle operation has negotiating power that a 500 head operation doesn't. The consolidation requires scale to survive. Smaller operators can position themselves as inputs to larger operations. They won't profit like independent ranchers once did, but they can stabilize income by accepting contracts earlier and working for consistent returns. This is pattern recognition, not advice. The system has been architected to make profit available only at scale. Operating at small scale is economically losing. The consolidation has made that trade permanent. The deeper protection lies in understanding what survives every consolidation of food systems the archives reveal. Local production resilience. When centralized supply chains break, local food production survives. The principle is documented throughout history. When you consolidate food production and distribution into one system, you create fragility. A disease, a supply chain disruption, a geopolitical event, any break in the system cascades into total failure. Local production is less efficient by consolidation metrics, but it's resilient by survival metrics. The rancher who loses money on contracts with Tyson and the consumer who buys cheap beef have both optimized for efficiency. The rancher with pasture, local animals, and direct customers has optimized for resilience. When the consolidated system breaks, one of those options survives and one doesn't. The records show this happening. In 2020, when COVID-19 shut down meatpacking plants, consolidated beef supply was disrupted. Ranchers had cattle with no place to send them. Consumers couldn't buy beef at stores. Independent ranchers who sold directly to consumers had waiting lists. The system revealed its fragility in real time. The consolidators had optimized for efficiency to the point of creating systemic risk. A small disruption created cascade failure. It took months to restore processing capacity. During that time, ranchers faced massive losses. The consolidated system was efficient right until it wasn't. Then it was catastrophically inefficient. Independent systems were slower and more expensive, but kept functioning. The pattern says what comes next. Stage 7 is regulatory response. The Biden administration created an executive order on meatpacking consolidation in 2021. The USDA has increased attention on beef processing. State governments have begun programs to support independent processing plants and rancher cooperatives. This is the historical pattern. After consolidation reaches a certain point and reveals systemic fragility, governments intervene. They won't easily break up Tyson, Cargill, and JBS. The infrastructure investments are too large. The supply chains are too integrated. But they might require them to sell cattle to independent processors. They might limit contract terms. They might subsidize processing plant construction to create alternatives. These interventions will increase prices. They will reduce efficiency, but they will increase resilience. The prediction is specific. By 2035, the consolidated system will face pressure to distribute, not by choice, by regulatory pressure and market fragility forcing distribution. The thing that was built, consolidated beef production with 4 companies controlling the flow, wasn't designed to be sustainable across century timescales. It was designed to maximize profit this quarter. Every consolidator optimizes for current return, not future resilience. When a large percentage of ranches disappear and the remaining ranchers are losing money, the system has created a demographic cliff. There are fewer ranchers each year. Soon there won't be enough ranchers to supply the processing plants. The consolidators are eating their own supply chain. They're optimizing ranchers into extinction. That's the mechanism's flaw, not immediately visible, only apparent across 3 decades, but documented. The historical records are remarkable. Observers in the early 20th century predicted this pattern. Theodore Roosevelt understood that unchecked consolidation would eventually threaten the very foundation of the industry. He tried to prevent it through regulation. The regulation changed the shape of the industry, but didn't stop the trend. Now, 100 years later, the consolidation has reduced the number of independent ranchers significantly. The trend line is toward total consolidation and the disappearance of ranching as an independent occupation. When that happens, when there are no independent ranchers remaining, the consolidators face a choice. Either they integrate backward and own ranches, creating massive capital expenditure and operational complexity, or they lose supply. Neither option works without fundamental system redesign. You walk into a supermarket and buy a pound of ground beef for $5. The efficiency of consolidation made that price possible. The rancher who raised that steer is often losing money. The processing plant that butchered it employs workers at wages that have struggled to keep up with inflation. The consolidator captured the profit. You got cheap protein. The system worked exactly as designed, but the design has a flaw that takes 100 years to become visible. The system is eating the rancher. When the rancher disappears, the system collapses. The archives show this in every food consolidation. It always looks efficient until it breaks, and when it breaks completely. If this pattern revealed something you'd never seen before, subscribe to the Gilded Archives. History's records reveal where consolidation always leads. The meatpacking system isn't unique. It's one iteration of a pattern that repeats across agriculture, energy, and finance. Understanding it allows you to see the pattern in the next food commodity, the next supply chain, the next consolidation that appears inevitable. The rancher losing money today is tomorrow's data point in a system collapse. The records already show how this ends. We're just watching it unfold.